what would a fake public health crisis look like? Well, first you'd need a new disease. You'd use words like deadly and mystery and rampaging and mutant. At first, no one would know where it comes from or how it's transmitted, and that would spark fear. And fear stops people thinking clearly. Fear would be your friend. All of this would be designed to drive emotion rather than impart information. People would start behaving irrationally, like buying 780 packs of toilet roll at once. Once this had happened, you'd know you were onto something. Next, you'd have rituals that you insist everyone follow. You'd make them avoid each other, stop shaking hands. You'd make them stand away from each other and wear masks. You'd make them wash their hands in an obsessive, compulsive manner, and you'd invite them not to notice that our species didn't do any of this for 50,000 years, and yet here we are. The cheerleaders of this would take on an almost religious air. They'd have mantras like hands, face, space, helpful if they rhyme, you see, and protect the NHS, relying on people's inability to remember that hospitals are supposed to protect people, not the other way round. You'd make this practice like a religious devotion. You'd have ludicrously over-the-top death rate predictions from scientists whose whole history is about massively overstating potential issues from diseases. You'd ignore that, and you'd know most people wouldn't even notice. Even when he disgraced himself and shown himself to be a hypocritical twat, you'd quietly bring him back to the media. Next, you'd convince the proles that healthy people with no symptoms were liable to infect and kill their grandma if they weren't wearing masks in mid-summer. You'd have cringy emotional advertising that a slow 7-year-old could see through and people would still swallow it. You'd be vague on detail. This bit is very important. You wouldn't say specifically what would get someone into a lockdown or a tier restriction, and you'd pretend not to notice when people saw areas with the same infection rates in different tiers. You'd keep changing the criteria often, so it was impossible to keep up with the latest rule changes, and even your goon enforcers would be bamboozled into assuming powers they just don't have. Most important, you'd never say to people how they could get out of this nightmare, either in terms of infection rates or death rates or hospital occupancy. You never give people this information, and that keeps them frightened. You'd make endless new laws, and you'd change them often, so it was impossible to know what was legal and what wasn't. Then you could rely on the government enforcement class to bully and browbeat people into submission. That and the gutless bootlicking cowards who seem to actually enjoy their oppression would be enough to ensure widespread compliance. Ayn Rand understood this when she said, "There's no way to rule innocent men. The only power any government has is the power to crack down on criminals." Well, when there aren't enough criminals, one simply makes them. One declares so many things to be a crime that it becomes impossible for men to live without breaking laws. Next, you'd line up formerly anonymous public health experts who love the spotlight far too much and have them say scary things in briefings before invited, tame media sources. These things would almost be instantly debunked as the garbage they are, but it wouldn't matter. Your state broadcaster and a few shills in commercial media would never report the debunking. Anytime there was a difficult question which called out your bullshit, you could simply attack the questioner as a crank and say, "You are only following the science." You could rely on the utter credulity of the people not to notice. If, for example, you said, "Don't wear masks," and then when the actual epidemic had subsided, you say, "Masks save lives," you'd be almost amazed at these utter morons swallowing two directly opposite and overtly contradictory statements without so much as a second look. You'd start to notice they were the epsilon semi-moron class from Brave New World come to life. You'd get your buddies in Big Pharma to devise a miracle cure and charge the plebs a fortune for it via the tax system. It may not work. The normal safety test would be rushed or abandoned altogether, and legal liability would be completely removed if your product ever proved to be, say, murderous. You'd rely on people not to notice that in almost every other walk of life you were responsible for your actions, but not here. You'd also make damn sure that safe and effective existing treatments you couldn't charge billions for were rubbished and disregarded. You'd have wholly illogical closures of parts of society. So maybe you'd close a gym, a swimming pool and a sports centre, things that actually promote better metabolic health, but not a fast food outlet. You'd say you were protecting people. Most drooling simpletons would accept this without question. You'd rely on a tame legacy media to simply read out press releases and supportive tweets. Anyone with contrary but accurate information would almost be disbarred from the television. The few that did get on would be personally attacked, screamed at, and have their motives questioned. The substance of their legitimate points would not be discussed. You'd have a few utterly contemptuous tossers called, say, Mears Porgan or something. They'd rant and rave to delight their low IQ audience. You'd sit them next to some aging adulterous slag called something like Susan Meads, who'd smile and occasionally chip in with some bile. You'd have a junk test guaranteed to produce any number of false positive results to baffle and hoodwink and terrify the simple-minded who believe the state broadcaster tells the truth. You know they'd never check this out, and they'd attack people who try to say, no, the European Journal of Microbiology has debunked this amplification rate as garbage, and even the inventor of the test says it's a nonsense. You'd have your buddies in social media censor and harass and suppress and delete everyone, from eminent professors to whole radio stations to presidents of countries. When you tear out a man's tongue, you're not proving him a liar. You're only telling the world you fear what he might have to say. But don't worry, most of the knuckle-dragging dunderheads won't know that. You'll need all the major politicians in lockstep. Not because they'll be voting on anything worth a damn. You'll be ruling by fiat and Parliament will be sidestepped into irrelevance. But you'll need the authority figures saying the same thing. They will, don't worry. They are bought and paid for shills. Next, you'd ramp up the pressure. You'd invent new variations and strains of this deadly disease. You'd pretend the heroin nurses you'd built up were buckling under the pressure, even as actual evidence showed hospital occupancy was below normal and they were still doing their cringy dance videos. You'd terrify cretins that they may not even be able to get healthcare at all, as hospitals were nearly full. You'd hope they wouldn't notice that because of your manufactured crisis they haven't been able to get healthcare for months. They wouldn't notice. They're so bamboozled and terrified that by now you could say anything, and they're so desperate for solution they'll believe anything. H.L. Mencken once said, "The whole aim of practical politics is to keep the populace alarmed and hence clamorous to be led to safety by an endless series of hobgoblins, most of them imaginary." You'd make sure, of course, that celebrities and insider politicians were never, ever prosecuted for breaches of the tyranny you dumped on everyone else. You'd put up with the most lame, unreal, lying apologies when they were caught out. This would be media figures and actors and newsreaders and even politicians themselves. They'd say don't eat out and be caught in restaurants. They'd say wear masks and not wear masks themselves. They'd say be alone for Christmas while flying out to the Caribbean. Not one of them would ever be prosecuted at a time when normal families were having their doors smashed down by the police. Next, you'd need to get really dark. You know your public health initiatives are pointless, and sooner or later, even the most dense, muzzled buffoon would say, hey, I've been locked up, unemployed with my mask on, unable to go anywhere for 10 months, and now you're saying things are worse than ever? So you'd create an internal enemy. The Russian communists did it with the kulaks. The Khmer Rouge did it with the intelligentsia. The Nazis did it with Jews, and the Catholics and Protestants have been doing it with each other for years. You get the point? The internal enemy here is people who don't wear masks. You see, if logical thinking people who can read studies that show they don't work would only have worn their masks, everything would be okay. You're an enemy of the people. We've seen this rhetoric before, and it's chilling. The historically aware know that this path leads to some very dark places. Orwell knew this. Big Brother had Emmanuel Goldstein. The pig and animal farm called Napoleon had Snowball. You convince utter fuckwits that if someone was not wearing a mask, they're the problem, and you goad them on to attack people who can actually think. Last and least, you know the Hegelian dialectic by heart. Problem, reaction, solution. Problem would be the health scare, reaction would be the destruction of liberty, and the solution would be the vaccine. You could get a large number of people to beg you to shove it into their arm. They wouldn't know or care that mRNA is hardly tested, nor reports of autoimmune diseases or Bell's palsy. They wouldn't know the manufacturer isn't legally liable. Then, when the summer rolled around and respiratory diseases fade, like they always do, and no amount of your bullshit can persuade people they're still in danger, you declare victory and cast yourself as the saviour. The country would be changed and much poorer. More people will be unemployed, homeless, and dead of actual untreated diseases. But you're the hero. You can then quit politics and go and live in Switzerland or New York and become unexpectedly fantastically wealthy. As it turns out, the same drug companies you gave billion-pound contracts to want to pay you vast sums of money for speeches. You'll become a millionaire many times over, and as long as you avoid a John Wilkes Booth type figure to give you a richly deserved end, you can live out your dotage in opulence. Wow, I'm sure glad nothing like that is happening. If you like this, please like, recommend, and subscribe.